Blacksmith, did the fire burn all your luck again?
The day the whole village ran for their lives, the man they once called useless was the only one standing between them and the armed raiders. But before that night of fire and screams, nobody looked at Obi with respect. If you enjoy powerful African stories filled with suspense and deep lessons, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Obi lived at the edge of Umudara village where the wind carried dust in the dry season and the smell of wet earth in the rains. His hut was small and old, with a bent roof and walls darkened by smoke. Beside it stood his workshop, a rough shelter made from wood, rusted iron sheets, and years of stubborn effort. That workshop was his world. From morning till night, fire danced before his face, and the sound of hammer on iron echoed through the village like a heartbeat nobody respected. Clang, clang, clang. That sound fed farmers, hunters, and traders, yet many still laughed at the hands that made their lives easier. Obi was a blacksmith, and in Umudara, people brought him broken hoes, dull knives, cracked metal bowls, bent traps, and damaged farm tools. He repaired everything with patience, skill, and silence. But because his clothes were always burnt at the edges, because his hands were dark with soot, because his feet wore old slippers, and because his pocket was never full, the people saw him as a poor man to be mocked. The children copied what they heard from their parents, and whenever Obi passed through the square, they whispered and giggled behind him. "See the man who lives with fire but cannot cook wealth for himself," they would say. The young men were worse. They sat beneath the nuku tree near the village center, chewing kola nut and talking loudly about people's lives as if mockery were a sport. The loudest among them was Odogu, the son of the richest farmer in the village. Odogu wore fine wrappers, rubbed oil on his skin, and walked like the earth owed him respect. Whenever Obi saw him, he smiled with the cruel joy of someone who had never known hunger.
Blacksmith, did the fire burn all your luck again?
He would ask, while his friends laughed like fools around him. Obi would only lower his eyes and keep walking, not because he was weak, but because he had learned that some people insult others only to hide how empty they are inside. The women in the market were not much kinder. Some brought him work, but spoke to him as if they were doing him a favor. Some would even hold the edge of their wrapper over their nose when they passed his workshop, as though honest labor had a bad smell. Only one person in Umudara spoke to Obi like he was a full human being. That person was Mama Nkem. Mama Nkem was an old widow with a bent back and gentle eyes that had seen too much pain to join in mocking another person. She sold roasted corn and firewood in front of her hut, and whenever Obi had no customer all day, she would call him over quietly. "Come and eat something before the fire eats you first," she would say. Sometimes it was a small piece of yam. Sometimes it was dry corn and palm oil. Sometimes it was just water and kind words. But to Obi, it meant more than a feast. He never forgot kindness. That was why, though the whole village laughed at him, bitterness never fully entered his heart. Yet, even a patient heart can grow heavy. At night, after the hammering stopped and the village fell silent, Obi would sit outside his hut and look into the dying fire. The red glow would dance in his eyes as old memories rose like smoke. He remembered his father, who had also been a blacksmith, a strong man with scarred hands and quiet wisdom. He remembered the words his father used to say whenever life became hard.
"Fire can destroy iron, but fire can also shape it into something strong,"
he would add. Obi held those words close through many dark years. His mother had died when he was young. His father died later from fever that money could not treat. And since then, Obi had lived alone with his furnace, his tools, and his stubborn hope for company. Still, there were days when loneliness pressed on him like a heavy stone. One afternoon, near the end of the dry season, the sun burned so hard that even the goats searched for shade in silence. Obi was walking on a broken hunting spear when Adeaze, the chief's daughter, passed by his workshop. She was carrying a small basket and walking towards the stream path. Unlike the others, she did not laugh at him. She only paused for a moment and looked at the spear in his hands.
You repaired my mother's cooking stand last month. It still has not broken again.
That is good.
He replied quietly. Adeaze looked at him a little longer, as if she wanted to say more, but before she could speak, the voices of two girls approached from behind her, and she simply walked on. One of the girls laughed the moment they passed the workshop.
Why do you even stop near that place? It smells like sweat and suffering.
She added. The girls burst into laughter and disappeared down the path. Obi looked back at his iron, but this time his hands tightened around the hammer. He said nothing. Still, the wound entered. That evening, when the sun had started sinking and the forest path was growing dark, Obi carried some scrap metal towards a trader in the next settlement. The journey was not far, and he hoped to return before full night. But halfway through the forest bend, he heard voices ahead. They were low and rough, and they did not sound like the voices of travelers. Obi quickly stepped behind a thick tree and held his breath. There were 5 men in the clearing, all armed. One had a gun hanging across his shoulder, another held a long cutlass that flashed in the fading light. Their clothes were dusty, and their eyes were the kind that did not fear blood. Obi's chest tightened as he listened.
The village sleeps early. The rich homes are near the center. We enter when the moon rises. Burn 2 huts first so people run in confusion. Take food, goats, money, and anyone who resists.
The first man finished. Obi felt his blood turn cold. Raiders! They were coming for Umudara. He stayed hidden until the men moved deeper into the trees. Then he ran. He ran faster than he had run in years, stumbling over roots, clutching his chest, gasping like a man chased by death. By the time he reached the village square, sweat was pouring down his face and his breath was broken. People were still outside, talking and preparing their evening meals. Children chased each other near the fire pits. Women arranged pots. Men sat in groups with lazy pride. Obi did not stop to gather himself. He shouted at once. "Raiders are coming," he cried. The square turned towards him. "Armed men are in the forest," he shouted again. "They said they will attack when the moon rises," he added. For 1 second, there was silence. Then Odogwu laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a doubtful laugh, a cruel, open laugh that invited others to join him. And they did. "Listen to the blacksmith," Odogwu shouted. "The fire smoke has entered his head today," he added. The men near him slapped their knees in laughter. One woman hissed and shook her head. Another muttered that poor people always look for drama. Obi turned towards the chief's compound at once. "Where is Chief Enyinna?" he asked desperately. The chief soon emerged wrapped in authority and pride. He was a man used to obedience, and he disliked being disturbed without ceremony. "What is this noise?" he demanded. Obi bowed slightly, breath still shaking. "Chief, I heard armed men in the forest," he said. "They said they will attack the village tonight," he added. Chief Enyinna stared at him for a long moment, then his face hardened. "And you expect me to throw this village into fear because of the words of a soot-covered blacksmith?" he asked coldly. Obi swallowed hard. "I know what I heard," he insisted. But Odogwu stepped forward before the chief could reply. "This man wants attention," Odogwu said. "Maybe customers did not come today, so he has decided to entertain us," he added. More laughter broke out. Even some elders smiled in that foolish way people smile when pride blinds them. Obi looked around the square and saw disbelief everywhere. Only Mama Nkem looked frightened. Only Adaizi looked uncertain. The chief lifted his hand and ended the matter with one sentence. "Go back to your fire, Obi," he said. "This village will not dance to the fear in your ears," he finished. That was the moment Obi understood something terrible. If he waited for them to believe him, the village would die in its pride. So he said no more. He turned and walked away while laughter followed him like stones. But once he reached his workshop, his quietness changed into action. He dropped the scrap metal he had carried and lit his furnace until the flames rose like anger. Then he began to work. He worked with the speed of fear and the focus of purpose. He melted iron. He sharpened rods. He hammered flat pieces into spikes. He tied bells to wire traps. He cut old chains. He shaped hooks. He repaired 3 broken spears he had kept from old jobs. He dragged heavy iron scraps toward the narrow paths that led into the center of the village. He set simple traps where feet would rush in darkness. He tied warning bells to hidden lines between trees. He forged short blades and placed them in bundles near huts. He worked without rest. Sweat poured down his back. Sparks landed on his skin. His arms shook from strain, but he did not stop. At midnight, Mama Nkem appeared at his doorway, holding a small lantern with trembling hands. "I knew they should have listened," she whispered. Obi looked up, startled. "You should stay inside," he told her. But the old woman stepped closer and saw the weapons, the traps, the sharpened rods, and the small plan he had drawn with charcoal on a flat board. Tears entered her eyes. "You are preparing to fight for the same people who mocked you," she said. Obi returned to the iron in his hand. "If I do nothing, innocent people will die," he replied. Mama Nkem stood in silence for a while. Then she set the lantern down and began handing him tools. From that moment, the poor blacksmith was no longer alone. Not long after, Adaize came quietly through the dark. She had overheard men talking and had begun to fear Obi was right. When she saw the furnace still blazing and the traps lined on the ground, her face changed with shock. "You are telling the truth," she whispered. Obi did not waste time on wounded pride. "If you want to help, wake the women nearest the stream and tell them to gather children in the old yam store behind Mama Nkem's hut," he said. Adaize stared at him for a second, surprised that the man everyone mocked was already thinking like a leader. Then she nodded and ran. The moon climbed higher, the village slept under false peace, and the forest moved. The first sign came as a faint bell in the darkness. Ting! It was one of Obi's warning lines. He straightened at once. Then came another and another. The readers had entered. Obi grabbed a spear, a hammer, and a burning torch. "Mama Nkem, stay low," he said. Then he stepped into the night. A scream rose from the eastern huts, then another. Flames burst upward from a thatched roof near the stream, painting the dark with terror. Dogs barked wildly, children cried out, men walked in confusion. The raiders stormed in with shouting, cutlasses, and fire. They expected sleep, they expected panic, they expected easy prey. But the first man who rushed down the narrow path stepped on Obi's iron spikes and fell with a howl that split the air. Another ran forward and tripped a hidden chain, crashing face first into the dust. A third pulled against a wire line and set off a row of clanging bells that woke half the village at once. "Up!" Obi shouted. "Wake up and run west!" he cried. His voice rose above the chaos like a drumbeat of survival. Men stumbled from their huts half awake, only to freeze at the sight of armed attackers. Some tried to fight and failed. Some ran without direction. Some rich braggarts who had laughed in the square earlier could not even hold their cutlasses properly in the dark. Odogun, who had mocked Obi the loudest, came charging with a stick in his hand and fear in his eyes. He swung wildly at a raider and missed so badly that he fell into a water pot and rolled in the mud like a child. The raider lifted his blade, and before it could fall, Obi's hammer flew through the dark and struck the man's wrist with a crack that made him scream. Odogun stared up from the mud in stunned silence. Obi didn't even look at him. "Get up and move the children," Obi shouted. Then he ran deeper into the smoke. Everywhere he went, he seemed to appear one breath before disaster. He pulled a crying boy out of a burning hut. He kicked over a pot of fire before it spread to another roof. He used his iron hook to drag one attacker off balance. He struck with precision, not waste. He knew the paths. He knew the narrow turns. He knew where feet would stumble and where shadows would hide. The village that had mocked his mind was now surviving because of it. Near the chief's compound, the fighting became worse. 3 raiders had broken through the center and were trying to force their way into the inner yard where Chief Enyinna and his family were trapped. The guards were already down. One lay wounded, the other had fled. Chief Enyinna held a spear, but his hands shook so badly that even he could see his own fear. Adaeze was standing behind him, trying to shield 2 small children with her body. The door beam was cracking. The raiders were almost inside. Then Obi arrived through the smoke, like a man forged by the same fire he worked with every day. He did not hesitate. He threw his torch at the first raider's face, blinding him for a second. He slammed his shoulder into the second man, sending both of them crashing into a wooden post. The third raider rushed forward with a blade, but Obi caught a hanging chain from the broken gate, wrapped it around his arm and yanked with all his strength. The blade dropped. Chief Enyinna stared in disbelief. Obi grabbed the chief's spear and thrust it into the ground before the fallen raider could rise again. "Take your family and move to the yam store," Obi ordered. For the first time in his life, Chief Enyinna obeyed him without argument. Still, the attack did not end. More raiders were entering from the western path, angry now, confused now, wounded now. They had expected easy victory, but instead they found resistance shaped by a man they had never counted. Obi knew they needed one final push, something that would break the attackers' courage. So he ran back to his workshop. The flames were still alive, the furnace still glowed, the stack of unfinished iron rods still stood by the wall. With the last of his strength, Obi lifted a metal basin filled with burning charcoal and hot sand. He tied it onto a handcart with chains, then he loaded the remaining iron spikes and stormed back toward the western path. 2 young men saw him and froze. "Stand there and die if you want, or follow me and fight for your home," he roared. Something in his voice broke their fear. They followed. Then more followed. Then more. The same villagers who had laughed at him were now running behind him, holding hoes, pestles, sticks, broken spears, and raw college. When they reached the western entrance, the raiders were regrouping for one more rush. Obi did not wait. He overturned the basin of blazing charcoal on the dry grass before them. Fire leapt across the path in a sudden wall of heat. The raiders recoiled. Before they could regain balance, Obi and the villagers charged with one united shout that shook the night. What followed was short, brutal, and final. The raiders, who were already injured by traps, disoriented by bells, and frustrated by resistance, began to retreat. One dragged another away. Another stumbled into the flames. One fired a shot into the air in panic, then fled into the forest. Within moments, the men who had come to destroy Omudara were running for their lives, and the village they had thought weak stood behind the poor blacksmith who had defeated them. Silence did not return at once. First came the crackling of burnt roofs, then the weeping of frightened children, then the low groans of the injured, and finally the sound of people breathing as if they had just awakened from a nightmare. Dawn slowly opened above Omudara. The sky turned grey, then pale gold. Smoke rose into the morning like the memory of terror refusing to leave. Villagers stepped carefully through ashes, broken wood, and scattered fear, and everywhere they turned, they saw the signs of Obi's hands, the iron spikes, the warning bells, the hidden chains, the sharpened rods, the rescued children, the saved compounds. The path of survival was written in blacksmith work from one end of the village to another. Chief Enyinna stood in the center of the square, surrounded by elders who could not meet each other's eyes. His wrapper was stained, his pride was broken, and before everyone, he called for Obi. But Obi was not in the square. He was back at his workshop, sitting on a wooden block, exhausted. His arm was cut, one side of his forehead was swollen, his hands were burnt in fresh places, yet he was still quietly repairing a bent farming blade someone had dropped in the chaos, as if the night had not turned him into the most important man in the village. When the villagers reached him, they stopped at the edge of the workshop like people entering a sacred place they had once insulted. No one laughed now. No one whispered now. Even Odogun kept his head down like a child caught in shame. Chief Enyinna stepped forward slowly. For a long moment he could not speak. Then he did something nobody had seen him do before. He bowed his head to Obi. "We were blind," the chief said quietly, "and last night that blindness nearly destroyed us," he added. The elders lowered their heads too. Mama Nkem stood at the back with tears running down her face.
Adaeze watched silently, her eyes full of a respect that no longer needed hiding. Chief Ezeani took a deeper breath and continued. "You warned us and we mocked you," he said. "You prepared for us and we doubted you," he added. "You fought for us and you saved us," he finished. Then before the whole village, the chief removed the red bead bracelet from his own wrist, a sign of honor in Omudara, and placed it in Obi's blackened hand.
A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through leaves. It was a moment nobody would forget. Odogu suddenly stepped forward, then dropped to his knees in the dust. The same mouth that once laughed the loudest now shook with shame. "Forgive me," he said. "I saw your poverty and thought it meant you were nothing," he added. Obi looked at him for a long second. Then he looked at the whole village, at the men who mocked him, at the women who avoided him, at the children who copied their parents' cruelty, at the chief who refused his warning, at the people whose lives he had saved anyway. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Poverty is not foolishness," he said. "And dirty hands do not mean an empty life," he added. The words fell into every heart like stones into still water. No one moved. No one spoke. Because truth had entered the village, and truth is never light when it arrives late. That same day, the villagers rebuilt Obi's workshop with stronger wood and better roofing. The farmers brought yams. The women brought soup and water. The hunters brought meat. The elders brought gifts. But the greatest gift was not food or cloth or money. It was the respect they had once refused him. From that day, nobody called Obi useless again. Children greeted him properly when he passed. Young men listened when he spoke. Women thanked him with full voices, and the chief invited him to sit among the men whose opinions shaped village decisions. But Obi remained the same inside. He still woke early. He still worked with fire. He still repaired simple tools. He still ate with gratitude. He still visited Mama Nkem with gifts she pretended not to need. He still spoke little. Yet, now every clang of his hammer carried a new meaning. It no longer sounded like the labor of a poor man people ignored. It sounded like the strength of a man the village almost lost through pride. As for Adeaze, she began visiting the workshop more often, sometimes with broken kitchen stands, sometimes with small errands that did not truly need doing. And though the village noticed, nobody mocked, because some stories do not need many words before they begin to grow. Years later, when children asked about the burnt marks near the western path and the old iron bells hanging beside Obi's workshop, their parents would tell them about the night Umudara nearly fell. They would tell them about the raiders, the fire, the screams, and the terror. But above all, they would tell them about the poor blacksmith they once laughed at, the man with ash on his clothes and strength in his soul, the man whose warning they rejected, the man whose fire saved them all. And each time the story ended, silence would fall for a moment, because even memory was ashamed of how long the village had taken to see his work. Moral lesson: never laugh at someone because they are poor, humble, or doing dirty work. The person you reject today may be the very one who saves you tomorrow. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to African Night Tales by Enyinna, because every week we bring you powerful stories that carry wisdom for your life. We will see you in the next story. May wisdom find you before trouble does. Bye-bye.